Ernst Kaltenbrunner's last statement before his execution left the Nuremberg court in unexpected silence.
It wasn't the moment people imagined, and what followed only deepened the questions around his final hours, under oath and under suspicion. The courtroom was already heavy with tension when the session resumed. Rows of observers sat rigidly, notebooks balanced on their knees, while military guards stood along the walls. The judges had returned to their seats. The translators adjusted their headphones, and the prosecutors prepared another series of precise, methodical questions. The man on the stand was Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer ever brought before the tribunal, and the man who, as chief of the Reich Main Security Office, oversaw the Gestapo, the SD, and the entire administrative structure that coordinated the Reich's political policing, intelligence, and extermination policies. He was at Nuremberg to be judged for his actions. But his behavior, his answers, and the last words he said after his sentence would stun the whole court. But before the final verdict was announced, Ernst Kaltenbrunner still needed to be questioned, still needed to be asked why he'd sanctioned all the atrocities the Gestapo and SD had been guilty of, still needed to be asked whether he felt any kind of guilt or remorse. Kaltenbrunner rose as instructed. He looked directly toward the bench, waiting for the first question. There was no sign of hesitation in his posture, no outward reaction to the gravity of the moment. He listened without interrupting, responding with short, controlled phrases that left the room trying to measure how much he intended to reveal and how much he intended to distance himself from. His responses indicated familiarity with the administrative structure within the Nazi Party, yet he avoided elaborating beyond what the questions required. And then the last question came when asked whether he felt any shame over his actions and orders at the height of the war. He replied, "I fought honorably. I have a clean conscience before God and man." The court was stunned into silence. Here was a man who had orchestrated the death and suffering of thousands, claiming to possess honor and conscience. It was clear at this very moment that no amount of compassion could save Ernst Kaltenbrunner from a death sentence. And perhaps he'd known it all along, because the path that had led him to this courtroom had begun long before the war, long before the First Order. And it would soon end with a statement that would make the last years of his life pale in comparison. The making of an enforcer. Music. Long before he stood in a courtroom, surrounded by judges and reporters, Ernst Kaltenbrunner was a young Austrian lawyer whose world was shifting faster than anyone could control. The Austria of his early adulthood was tense, politically fractured, and increasingly drawn toward extremes. He graduated from Graz University in 1925 with a doctorate in law, entering a profession built on order and rules at a time when both were becoming rare. Colleagues later said he was ambitious, driven, and determined to rise, qualities that made his next steps less surprising in hindsight than they seemed at the time. By the early 1930s, he had joined the Austrian Nazi Party, a move that placed him on the edge of legal and political conflict. The party was banned, openly monitored, and known for its attempts to undermine the Austrian government. For many members, that was part of the appeal. They believed the old political system was collapsing, and that backing the movement early would position them well once change arrived. Kaltenbrunner was among those who stepped into the growing underground network, a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He was soon drawn into the orbit of men who were rising quickly within the movement. He worked alongside figures like Arthur Seyss-Inquart and Adolf Eichmann, both of whom would play major roles in the regime that followed. These connections mattered. They positioned him not just as a supporter of the party, but as someone trusted within its inner circles. When Austria entered a period of deep political crisis, he was already seen as someone willing to take risks for the cause. That reputation came with consequences. In 1934, after the assassination of Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dulles by Nazi supporters, Kaltenbrunner was arrested and charged with conspiracy. The government believed the plot involved far more than the gunman who carried it out, and he became one of the men they wanted to hold responsible. He was convicted and served 6 months in prison. The sentence did not slow his rise. If anything, it enhanced his standing within the movement. Among party loyalists, imprisonment for the cause was seen as confirmation of commitment. When he emerged from custody, the political landscape was preparing to change dramatically. Pressure from Germany grew stronger, and Austria struggled to hold its independence. Those inside the Nazi network positioned themselves for the moment they believed was coming. Kaltenbrunner was one of them. By the time the Anschluss took place in 1938, bringing Austria under Nazi control, he was ready. The new authorities rewarded those who had supported them early, and he quickly received posts that aligned him with the expanding security system. He became police chief in Vienna, then secured a place in the Reichstag. His responsibilities widened, and with each year, his influence grew. Those who watched him rise noticed that he gained authority not through public speeches or ideological writing, but through administrative discipline and his ability to manage the machinery of enforcement. He belonged to the group that operated behind doors rather than in front of crowds. By the time his voice echoed through the courtroom years later, the trajectory was clear, and everyone present understood it. He had not been a spectator carried by events. He had been moving steadily toward power long before the world was forced to reckon with his name. And when that power shifted within his grasp, he grabbed it tight and held on at the center of the machine. When Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated in 1942, the position he left behind was not simply a title. It was the nerve center of the regime's internal power. Whoever stepped into that role would inherit oversight of intelligence branches, security police, and the administrative structure that linked local actions to national directives. When Ernst Kaltenbrunner was appointed to lead the Reich Main Security Office, the decision confirmed how deeply he had already been woven into the system. From that point forward, he was no longer a rising figure with regional influence. He was a man positioned at the top of an institution that shaped daily life across occupied territories. The office he controlled was divided into multiple departments, each responsible for a different part of the state's security apparatus. Some collected intelligence, others monitored political activity, and others enforced internal policies. Every action required paperwork, signatures, and authorization channels. Many of the documents presented later at Nuremberg bore either his name or the name of a department that reported directly to him. Even in the rare cases when he did not personally sign a directive, the structure placed him above those who did. That chain of responsibility became one of the most important elements of the prosecution's case. Inside the organization, information flowed in two directions. Reports arrived from regional offices, detailing arrests, movements, and internal operations. Orders traveled outward, instructing how to respond to perceived threats and how to maintain control. As the war expanded, those channels grew heavier with activity. Witnesses who worked within the security structure later described a system that operated with precision, and they placed Kaltenbrunner at the point where intelligence, enforcement, and supervision intersected. The scale of oversight that came with his role became a major factor in the tribunal's effort to understand how each part of the larger network functioned. He later claimed that many operations were carried out without his knowledge, and that decisions were made by subordinates who acted independently. Himmler alone gave the orders. "I never issued a directive for persecution," he said about the persecution of Jews, only to be shown documents bearing his signature. I only learned of these things after the collapse of Germany, he said about mass extermination, only to be reminded of the central role of the Reich Main Security Office in the operation, an office he was chief of. I never visited a concentration camp in my life, he even claimed, even though multiple reports contradicted his version of the events. The position he held was not designed for distance. It required oversight, briefings, and periodic reviews. He received summaries that outlined activities across various regions. He reviewed personnel matters for offices tied to political policing. He signed off on recommendations that shaped how the system responded to resistance, espionage, or perceived disloyalty. Those documents are falsified or misinterpreted, he claimed every time a proof was produced. But the structure itself placed him at the center. The prosecutors at Nuremberg later presented evidence that showed how the office coordinated deportations, monitored political opponents, and managed internal security priorities. Although individuals within the network carried out the actions, the decisions to initiate or approve them often moved through channels that led upward toward the RSHA to Kaltenbrunner himself. By the time the war reached its final year, his office was handling reports from collapsing fronts, disrupted communication lines, and regions under increasing pressure. Yet the machinery of internal control continued to function. The tribunal examined how those final months were managed, and the evidence showed that he remained active in directing the security apparatus even as the situation deteriorated. The continuity of his involvement underlined the prosecution's view that he had been a central actor from the beginning until the end. Still, he tried to distance himself from his actions. Immediately after receiving knowledge of this fact, he said about the final solution, "I fought just as I had done previously, not only against it, but also against this type of treatment of the Jewish problem. I protested to Hitler and the next day to Himmler." He maintained throughout the trial. The judges listened to his explanations, but the documents, the testimony, and the organizational structure surrounding him pointed toward a role that was far more involved than he portrayed. The office he led was not a passive extension of others' decisions. It was one of the regime's most influential arms, and at its center stood the man now trying to redefine his place in its history. The statement that stunned the Nuremberg court. When the judges instructed Ernst Kaltenbrunner to stand and deliver his last statement in the courtroom shifted into a different kind of quiet. It was not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of a room weighing months of evidence against whatever he was about to say. No one expected emotion. No one expected an apology. At most, observers thought he might repeat the narrow legal arguments he had used throughout the trial, but he spoke with steady precision. His statement avoided broad explanations or technical disputes. He did not engage with the documents the prosecutors had laid out for months. Nor did he attempt to break down the chain of command that had tied him to the security apparatus. Instead, he focused entirely on redefining his role. He insisted that he had acted lawfully at every stage of his career. He argued that the responsibilities attributed to him were carried out by others without his knowledge. He framed himself not as a director of policy, but as a man removed from decisions that the world now examined in detail. "I had no authority over the concentration camps or the Gestapo," he declared, even though he had just explained what his role as chief of the RSHA entailed. When asked to clarify how that was possible, he replied, "The RSHA was not an executive agency. It had no authority to order arrests or executions." The judges watched him closely. His tone was calm, almost clinical. He claimed he had never intended harm. He implied that he had been misled or bypassed. He maintained that his duties involved intelligence, not the actions that had been presented in court. These assertions were not new, but the way he delivered them, condensed into a final declaration, made the moment different from any previous exchange. He wasn't adjusting a detail or correcting a misunderstanding. He was rejecting the core of the prosecution's case. He was dismissing the documents bearing his signature, the reports that flowed through the office he led, and the responsibilities that his position inherently carried. Reporters wrote that even seasoned judges appeared momentarily taken back by how completely he separated himself from the evidence. It was not defiance in tone, but defiance in substance, and it reshaped the room's mood instantly. His hands remained lightly on the rail as he spoke. He did not gesture or raise his voice. Instead of emotion, he relied on certainty. This was the version of himself he wanted preserved. He claimed he had done his duty. He claimed he had fulfilled his responsibilities as he understood them. He warned against misinterpreting his actions. He portrayed himself as a man wrongfully linked to the crimes discussed in the trial. Even though he had held a position at the center of the security system being examined. "I never gave an order to kill a Jew or any other human being," he claimed. "I am guilty of only one thing, remaining in my post too long." The silence that followed each sentence carried more weight than the statements themselves. The judges didn't interrupt. The prosecutors didn't challenge him. They let the declaration stand because they knew it was his final one. When he finished, he stepped back from the rail, with the same controlled posture he had maintained at the start. Nothing in his demeanor suggested doubt. Nothing suggested hesitance. He had made his final argument exactly as he intended. This was Ernst Kaltenbrunner's unexpected final stance, delivered with unwavering confidence, and it left the Nuremberg court stunned. Yet the courtroom would not be the last place he spoke. Hours later, in a quiet chamber away from the public eye, he delivered a different kind of statement, one that revealed how he chose to define himself in the final moments of his life. The last walk. The hours after sentencing unfolded without ceremony. Ernst Kalten remained inside the prison compound, separated from the courtroom that had defined the final months of his life. The noise of arguments, translators, and public observers was gone. In its place stood a narrow corridor, a few guards, and a strict schedule that left no space for delay or reconsideration. When the time came, shortly after 1 o'clock in the morning, the officials assembled in the dimly lit execution area and prepared for the next condemned man in the sequence. At 1:36 a.m., Kaltenbrunner entered the chamber. He wore a sweater beneath a blue double-breasted coat, a small attempt at warmth in a room built for procedure rather than comfort. Witnesses noted the sharp lines of his face, the same dueling scars that had appeared in photographs years before. He looked around briefly, not with hesitation, but with a quick, assessing glance. Howard K. Smith, one of the journalists present, later wrote that there was something unsettling in his appearance, something that reflected both the authority he once held and the consequences he now faced. He stepped forward when instructed. The walk was steady without any break in pace. The officials remained focused on their responsibilities, and Kaltenbrunner concentrated on the final statement he intended to deliver. When invited to speak, he did so in a calm, controlled voice. He offered his last point blank. He offered his last point blank. He offered his last point blank. Declaration, one he shaped as both a farewell and a defense. He reportedly began with the words, "I refuse to die silent," before continuing with his final declaration. "I have loved my German people and my fatherland with a warm heart. I have done my duty by the laws of my people, and I'm sorry my people were led this time by men who were not soldiers, and that crimes were committed of which I had no knowledge." There was no attempt to extend the moment. He did not look for approval or acknowledgement. He simply finished his declaration and prepared for the final step. As the black hood was lifted, he spoke once more, still in a low voice. He used a short German phrase that witnesses translated as, "Germany, good luck." It was neither dramatic nor shouted. It was spoken as a simple farewell, directed not at the room, but toward the idea of the nation he had invoked throughout the trial. The officials completed their duties with practiced efficiency. The chamber remained quiet, marked only by the minimal movement of those required to be present. There were no disruptions, no commentary, and no delay. For the witnesses, the scene closed as swiftly as it began. The journalist later recalled the composure with which Kaltenbrunner faced the final moments, noting that his demeanor reflected the rigid control he had displayed throughout the trial. Once the procedure concluded, the officials filed out in order. The chamber returned to stillness, and the records of the night were entered into the logs. His final words, preserved by those who stood closest, became part of the historical record. They reflected his final attempt to define himself, even as the world judged him by a very different standard. The man who had once stood at the center of a vast security system ended his life in a quiet room with only a few witnesses. His last statement, shaped by loyalty, denial, and a final farewell, marked the closing moment of a life intertwined with some of the most destructive actions of the era. After the sentence, with the executions completed and the prison returned to routine, attention shifted back to the courtroom where the trial had unfolded over many months. The final documents were archived, the witness transcripts preserved, and the judgments entered into the historical record. In the days that followed, legal scholars, journalists, and observers began examining not only the verdicts themselves, but the statements delivered by the defendants in their final moments before sentencing. Ernst Kaltenbrunner's last words before his execution became a central point of discussion, not because they altered the outcome, but because they captured the strategy he carried to the very end. "My conscience is clear. I have fought honorably. I have committed no crime against humanity," he said. His insistence that he had acted within the law, his claim that he had never knowingly committed a crime, and his attempt to distance himself from the operations of the office he led, drew wide commentary. Some saw his final declaration as expected, a continuation of the approach he had used throughout the trial. Others noted the striking contrast between the record presented in court and the certainty with which he defended himself. That contrast became one of the elements that shaped how the proceedings were later interpreted. As reports of his execution circulated, the tone of his final courtroom declaration took on additional weight. Observers reconsidered how he had opened his last address, insisting he refused to die silent, and how that set the stage for the denial that followed. It was a final effort to shape his own legacy, offered at the exact moment when the tribunal was preparing to record its judgment. Rather than soften the accusations or acknowledge the system he had served, he used his last opportunity to reinforce the version of himself he wanted preserved. In the broader context of Nuremberg, his case became an example of how senior figures responded when confronted with full legal scrutiny. Some acknowledged responsibility, others offered limited explanations. But his approach stood out for the completeness of his denial, maintained without deviation from the beginning of the trial to the final hour of his life, even after hearing the evidence and witnessing the outcome of other cases. He chose to present himself as a loyal official wrongfully implicated in the actions of others. As historians reviewed the trial in the years that followed, they noted that his last statement reflected not only a legal defense, but a broader effort to control how he would enter the historical record. It did not change the judgment, but it left a distinct impression on those who heard it, influencing how his role was discussed and remembered.